Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the Great Lakes Tech Show. I'm Charlie Moses with the Ohio Telecom Association. On behalf of Indiana and Michigan associations, welcome. Thank you all for being part of this conference. We want special thanks to our sponsors and to our speakers. It's really, we can't do this without you, and really do appreciate the effort in this very unusual time that we're in. Today, we're going to have 2 sessions here, one at 10 and then 10:30. At 11 to 12, we'll be doing the expo, and then concurrent sessions at noon to 12:30, and then 12:30 to 1, we'll be doing the networking or speed dating, as we like to call it. So thanks to all of you for being part of this, and I'm going to turn it over to Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's see how we do this sharing thing here on this platform. Oh no, Google wants me to open. Sorry, hadn't tested this part yet. We'll get that. Okay, you're gonna love this. I can't share my screen in this platform without quitting and reopening it because I'm on a Mac. Oh no, maybe. Sorry, technical. I got it. Technical difficulties. Don't you just love it in this world we're in? All right, let's get this going. Apologize for that. Apologize. Come on. There we go. All right, let's talk about 10G. So as mentioned, I am Teresa McGaughey, and I'm the Area Vice President for our Access and Field Marketing Organization. I've been with the company now for, gosh, it's been almost 14 years, which is a little scary to say, and been in access even longer than that. So have a long history of that. But let's start with talking about, as you already heard, 2020 has been quite a crazy year. And clearly, we have figured out that our vision is not clear. It's taught us a lot, though. I can imagine that your crystal ball has, didn't really foresee this year, but it has taught us that the future is always changing, and we can adapt if we're strong and continue to accept change, so to speak. Subscriber demands can change rapidly as well. Broadband really enables the world to function. So, your kids at school, everybody are having to figure out how to utilize broadband even more and more in our current environment. At the beginning of the year, I ran a webinar and we talked about this type of growth. Pre-2020, growth was happening. It's been happening all along. Global internet traffic is going to grow 3 times between those years. 5 times the busy hour internet traffic is going to continue to grow almost 5 times. But what has happened in 2020 with growth, and you probably can all figure this out or see this, is it's actually been a major shift in what's going on. So that growth line continues. However, during the year of 2020, we saw this major uptick in the need and demand for bandwidth. But growth will continue. It'll just level off. It'll get back to its original growth path. It'll just never go back down to the previous level we saw. Netflix saw some pretty significant growth where they had been declining in years past. Think about it. Peloton, gyms, your gyms moved to your home. 66% membership growth for companies like Peloton. Cloud service, we all have to figure out now how to get our files from place to place. We're no longer transmitting data in paper format. It's pretty much coming from files over the internet in some way, shape, or form. And then Zoom. While this platform here is not necessarily Zoom, it could be behind the scenes Zoom. The world has really gone to Zoom. It's now become, like Kleenex. It's that, let's go have a Zoom call. It's that kind of thing now. So pretty interesting. And in addition to that, the work and school from anywhere, it's actually not going away. I don't know how many of your companies have seen this, but our company, for instance, we are still not working in our offices. And we don't have a date as to when we'll be going back. We have, skeleton crew, maybe, 1% of people are in the offices, and that's really just to maintain some facilities and, of course, our infrastructure that we need to function as a company. And you're probably seeing this. I know I was just talking to somebody just the other day, and he's now looking to buy desks and set up a home office because he thought it was temporary, and he's now been told he won't be going back into an office until at least 2022. So this is a new norm. It really is truly a new norm. And speaking of Zoom and all the various activities that we're going to be doing from a virtual perspective, there are some other key applications that are driving the demand for bandwidth. Let's look at, fixed wireless mobile networks, seeing a lot of need for 5G. 5G continues to be a big driver. I mean, the recent announcement with Apple and the iPhone 12 and Verizon and that partnership to bring 5G to your cell phones, we're going to have to transport that traffic. So that's one of the applications that's really generating demand. Multi-tenant units, multi-dwelling units. So tenant units, we just talked about offices maybe not needing, having as many people. So the bandwidth into that building for usage within the building is not going to continue to be significant, but maybe outside of that for sure. Multi-dwelling units, more and more people are living in, units such as that, and they need bandwidth just like everyone else. And then, of course, the applications, we just highlighted a few of them. They're continuing to drive that bandwidth. But when you add everything up, it's an interesting data point that we should always look at, is when you look at all of the data that's being utilized, we start to see, streaming video, gaming, immersive VR, all of these applications, but probably in most homes, it's roughly around, 300 megabits or 100 to 300 megabits, now. It could be a little bit more, a little bit less. We see those outliers that are using a lot more. Maybe they're VR all the time, that type of thing. But what does that mean? That kind of means that GPON is probably not out of bandwidth. And most of the analysis that we've done with our service providers, we've seen that it's about 20 to 30% utilization. So yeah, it's got quite a bit of runway left on it. And so we often then ask the question, well, why are we spending so much time talking about 10 gig? So as we look at that, let's take a moment. So really, why is now the time for 10 gig PON? 1 gig service works fine on GPON, not a problem. But think about it. In some of your territories or regions that you're deploying, you may have, say, a competitor that decides they're going to roll out 2 gig. Well, how do you respond to that 2 gig deployment, that 2 gig competition, for instance? One way you need to do is potentially roll out 10 gigs so that you can now deliver at least a 2 gig service to compete. So if you have 10 gig out there, you can just literally flip that bandwidth switch and meet that. Or you could even say, jump right over them and say, hey, I'm going to offer a 10 gig service. If you want more than 1 gig, I've got a 2 gig, I've got a 10 gig. I'm the one that can deliver what you need. So those are one of the main reasons that we're seeing a lot of folks deliver a 10 gig PON. The other reason is, if you look at it, access networks are a long-term investment. So if you're building a new network now or expanding into a new territory, new region, why would you put in, say, GPON today when you're going to have that competition, or that you're going to need more bandwidth, or you're going to have those high power users that are going to need 10 gig PON, and you would just put 10 gig PON out in those new locations, and then you don't have to touch them. That access network allows you to then go focus on growth and continuing to grow your network elsewhere. So if we look at it and just kind of visualizing what I just described, if you think about it, if you decide you're rolling out into a new region, say, these 2 blue locations, you put in GPON in that location, and you roll out and you say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and move into some other territories. And I start expanding my network, but wait a minute. I either have competition in that first blue area, or I've got a few outlying subscribers that really need more bandwidth. So now I have to go back and touch those subscribers. I have to go back and roll a truck and deliver a new ONT to them, and I have to upgrade their service when I could have been spending more time upgrading or adding more subscribers. So that's kind of the concept there, and something to think about in your business cases as you're looking at what technology to deploy. And if you think about it, that truck roll, I hear all kinds of different numbers. I'm going to be fairly, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to put a truck roll at $100. They're probably more in many cases, and in other cases, they may be less. It's roughly, and you may have numbers that you use, but if you use $100 and then you say, okay, in the first 2 to 3 years, maybe the 10 gig PON ONT is going to get down to say $80. So that's a future price. In the math that we've done and the calculations for business cases, if you have to upgrade roughly 20% of your subscribers over that period of time to a 10 gig PON, you've now made it so that you should have just deployed 10 gig PON in the first place. And then all of that time spent upgrading those existing customers could have been used for installing new customers. Not necessarily something you can put $1 to, but certainly something to think about as well. So that's in new areas we just talked about. But if you had a GPON network deployed already, which I suspect most of you have GPON somewhere, what should you do with those subscribers? Well, I just mentioned they're not out of bandwidth today. So the simple answer really is nothing, unless you have those high power users. So now in this case, you've already got GPON deployed. You're not putting money out there. You're not spending new money on GPON. You have that already deployed. So you don't need to go touch it and spend more money on those. Just touch the customers that need to be upgraded. Either they are high bandwidth users so that your PON, you need to either reduce the split ratio or you need to move them to 10 gig PON so that your other subscribers on that PON have enough bandwidth. Either way, that just solves that problem, and it's the simplest way to go. Then in that case, you're not spending effectively new money, all this great new funding like RDOF or any of the other CARES Act dollars on the older technology. You're really setting yourself up for the future. So I want to take a moment and just kind of walk through the network at the different parts of the network and look at how all of the bandwidth that we just talked about does have an impact. So there are some places that you should think about from a GPON or from a network perspective where there is some actual impact. And if you look at the first place, let's start at the home. In the home, from a Wi-Fi perspective, you're probably already looking at Wi-Fi 6, but if not, you're going to want to make sure that you're deploying Wi-Fi 6 in that area. We did just talk about the GPON or the PON network, and if you've got GPON with those subscribers, they're fine. Don't worry about it. Just touch the ones you need to touch. One of the areas to really think about, though, is also as you're deploying your network or your existing network is the aggregation point. So as we saw that increase in bandwidth, I've heard from lots of service providers that they're now seeing their aggregation links hit that 50% mark. And once you hit that 50% mark, especially if you're using link aggregation or maybe, or some other, technology where a fallback is required, you have a redundant kind of configuration. Once you hit that 50% mark, you're probably at a point where when you do that failover, you've lost some of your bandwidth capacity and you can no longer offer the service, the high quality service you want to have. So with that in mind, that's the area that we do recommend you spend some time focusing on in your existing network. Make sure that aggregation point has the capacity you need to handle that slight uptick in GPON usage that has occurred. You're going to see this in a couple of parts in the network, so the edge router as well as the aggregation. And then ultimately, again, as you're aggregating all of these subscribers up towards your network, you're probably going to start to see some areas up in the other parts of the network as well. So just as a recommendation, we like to make sure that you've kind of focused on that aggregation point. So now let's take a moment and kind of switch to deploying 10 gig PON. So we've kind of said, if you're deploying something new right now, a new region, new area, go 10 gig PON. If you need to add some subscribers, higher bandwidth technology for some of your subscribers, then there's also some ways you need to do that. So we'll focus on the technologies. There's quite a few PON technologies that are out there today, and you may not be familiar with all of these. The real ones to focus on are the GPON, which we just talked about. And then at the bottom, you'll see the bottom two, which are XGS PON, which is our standard ITU 10 gig symmetric PON. Does 10 gig down, 10 gig up. It also will do 10 gig down, 2.5 gig up. That's not really as widely deployed in North America. Most people are deploying 1010, the XGS PON technology at the bottom there, or second to bottom. And then there's NG-PON 2, which is a multi-wavelength technology. That's been widely deployed by Verizon and some other carriers, but not as widely as XGS PON. And I would be remiss if I didn't make sure that you were aware that just like GPON is slowly being folks are slowly transitioning into deploying XGS PON for new deployment. There's always that next new PON technology. And focusing on the ITU standards, which are really here in North America, want to highlight some technologies that are being discussed, and I've got them in color coded over here on the right hand side. There's the bottom one, which is a 50 gig PON. So 50 gig PON is essentially XGS PON, but it's got three options for the bandwidths. 50 gig down is always the case, and then the upstream could either be 10, 25, or 50. Right now, the standards bodies are really focused at the 50, 10, or 50, 25. It was supposed to be really moved forward within the standards last month, but as you can imagine, well, there was debate in the standards bodies, as well as a variety of things this year. Nothing's doing what we would expect it to do, so therefore it got postponed. It looks like it probably should move forward in the standards in about 8 months in their next meeting. So, but we can anticipate that we'll see that as the next new ITU standard that we might be talking about in the future. There's also a technology called Super PON, which hasn't been really readily accepted or addressed, I should say more appropriately, in the ITU standards at this point. And that provides active components out in the field for effectively getting longer distance on PONs. And then there's a TWDM standard, which is kind of stalled at this point. We anticipate that will move forward. It just hasn't moved forward as much this year as we would have expected. So as we deploy technologies, the point of talking about the previous standards was that every time we deploy standard, whether we're deploying in a green field, we have no technology deployed today, no PON, it's a brand new area, or whether we're deploying in a brown field, we always have to be aware of the fact that there is a new PON technology coming at some point in the future. And as I previously mentioned, access networks are a long-term investment. Many of you are probably running a depreciation scale in the 7 to 10 or maybe even more years, and therefore you want to make sure that you can truly depreciate that asset from a financial perspective and not be changing things too rapidly. So that's part of the point of making sure we think about 10 gig PON. So let's start with some recommendations. If you're just getting started, like I mentioned, greenfield network, brand new service provider, or just a new territory where you have no PON deployed today, just go with 10 gig PON. You're building it once, you eliminate the need to upgrade, no need to change subscriber ONTs in the future. You've got a lower overall just deployment total cost of ownership because you've got one technology. It becomes one, simple from start to finish all through the entire deployment process. But if you have an existing PON, GPON, most likely in your case, what do you do, as we already discussed? And you want to add XGS PON into that area in the network. So what we're seeing most often is that our service providers that are deploying 10 gig PON are just literally using an additional feeder fiber in the network to add the 10 gig PON, the XGS PON. They add a new, if this is a CO or if it's a cabinet in that blue circle, either way, add that splitter either in the cabinet or add that splitter in the central office and go. It's super simple. You don't add additional components in the network, and you can easily just move your subscribers, between the GPON or the XGS PON as needed when you're deploying. So one of the benefits of doing it this way is that you've probably deployed your GPON utilizing a 32-way split. That seems to be the most common here in North America. And if you've done that, then you want to overlay or the XGS PON with the GPON on the same fiber, then you're really stuck with that 32-way split. If you deploy it in this way, you can actually increase your split ratio in XGS PON, because remember, I just said the GPON is not out of bandwidth, which means now you could go with a split ratio in XGS PON maybe as high as 128-way split. And because of that, you can significantly reduce the overall cost of deploying XGS PON, and in that sense, really get the best financial bang for the buck, so to speak. Now, let's talk about a couple of other ways to add 10 gig PON in the network. So one of those is if you're in a scenario where you don't have that extra feeder fiber, there is an option called a coexistence element, which you add in front of or after the line cards, I should say. And that will then take that XGS PON and put it onto those wavelengths onto the same fiber as the GPON. In this case, you're utilizing the same splitter. You're going to have the number of splitters. It really stays fixed out at the wherever it's located, especially if it's a remote. If you want to get that same higher split ratio, you can, if you so choose, add, say, for instance, a 2-to-1 pre-CE, that coexistence element splitter to overlay a couple of GPONs onto the XGS PON. So that's one option. Every time you're adding those additional components, as you know, optical budgets matter, and you're obviously utilizing some additional budget for those additional components. So something to think about. The other thing to think about from that perspective is that as you go and add, I mentioned the optical budgets, you could do something like, if you've got a couple of subscribers that are at the limit of the optical budget, the range there, you could add, say, a C+ optic or extended range optics to try to compensate for that in those cases. If you've got a cascaded type splitter scenario, you're going to have a lot more issues in that case, and your only option really is to add the CE, the coexistence element, instead of doing the additional feeder fiber, because you're really going to have obviously double every single one of these splitters out here for the XGS PON. So that's just something to think about from an architectural perspective. There's another technology that's out there that's being talked about, and I want to make sure that no presentation would be complete if we didn't talk about all the options. And that is what folks are calling, you can call it combo PON, combi optics. It's officially, the title is multi-protocol module. So it's an optic which has a coexistence element integrated into it. So that same one that I just showed as an external element is integrated into the optic, and it supports both GPON and XGS PON in the single optic. Sounds really awesome. Lets you do what you're doing here, puts it all together if you've got that. The main reason these were developed was really focused in China and the COs. They did not have space for the additional OLTs to add XGS PON. You can imagine lots of people, lots of OLTs, et cetera, and so forth. So it was really focused at space savings. The challenge is that it really, you cannot use additional split ratios for the XGS PON, so you don't get to take advantage of the XGS PON additional capacity. And it does require you, if you've got existing GPON out there deployed today, you have to replace the existing GPON to be able to use this new optic. This optic does not work in existing OLTs, so you have to have a new OLT. So that means that you're now going out and replacing OLTs that were once, they're out there and working perfectly fine, which financially doesn't seem like the best thing to do. Again, with the cascaded splitters, you pretty much have the same situation here. You don't have the opportunity to use, for instance, that pre-CE as well to get more capacity out of the XGS PON, because everything's very fixed and very limited from that perspective. And you have to, the ODN has to be, what is built to the limit of the GPON, not the XGS PON. So just things to think about if you look at this option. You'll want, if you want to add another PON technology in the future, when you've got this all integrated like this, it gets a little bit more difficult to do that. There are some increased power requirements because you have to compensate. That OLT has to utilize a little bit higher transmit power, and the optic requires a little bit higher power as well. There's some cost. Obviously, you're upgrading the entire GPON card, which could require system upgrades depending on the solution. And you already have the GPON bought out there, so you're now adding, if you no need to replace it. And if you decide you want to ultimately move all those subscribers to XGS PON, you've got a lot of GPON capacity sitting in this configuration that's never going to get used because you can't move it. It's sitting in that line card that's already there. So something just to think about. So back to our simplest way to get started with 10 gig PON. If we look at a scenario where we're utilizing feeder fiber, just wanted to highlight this one a little bit further as we come towards the end of the discussion here, is, it becomes, you've got a couple of GPONs, this is going to be a lot more, obviously, in your network. You'll probably have several different, more line cards. But as you go to upgrade, subscribers, you're simply utilizing, by moving them to a different splitter in whatever location. Something to think about is these subscribers can be located on OLT ports all over your system. So going back to that MPM, the Combi PON, every time you want to move a subscriber to XGS PON, you're actually in that combo line card. You're actually having to upgrade the optic in that location. In this location, you can continue to utilize the full capacity of the XGS PON optics that you've installed here and not have to upgrade different optics as you go. Ultimately, over time, what you get to is a GPON line card that can be either decommissioned and removed from your system, or moved to another location should you want to use GPON in another location, or it can be used as spares, whatever the case may be. And you can continue to move and do your upgrades and deployment in that way. So with that said, what I wanted to do is just kind of sum it up as key takeaways here. The GPON network is deployed already. The recommendation is eliminate complexity. Don't make this hard. Utilize existing feeder fiber to add your XGS PON. Gives you a lot of benefit from that perspective. It's the simplest way to go, and is actually, over the total time of the network, it is the lowest cost of the deployment options. If you're building a new network, save the upgrade costs. Just deploy XGS PON day one. Make it simple again. And the future is always changing. So whatever choice you decide to make sure that you're thinking about where we're going to be in, hopefully, next year, 2 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be. Just make sure that you think about the future, because we don't want to make decisions today that make our future significantly more challenged. So from that perspective, we say just let it be 10G. Thank you.